This Shabbat, our Parsha, our Torah reading begins as follows. When you enter the land that the Lord your God is giving you as a heritage and you possess and settle in it. What do you think the first thing is you have to do once you enter the land and you possess and settle in it? You'll take some of the first fruit of the soil which you harvest from the land, put it in a basket, and go to the place where God has established. Go to the priest in charge and say to him, I acknowledge that God has allowed me to enter the land. In other words, the first thing you do is pay taxes. It's true. That's what you do. You've got the land, now you fill out the IRS form. And I want to bring this to your attention because I want to speak this morning about something that we all realize on some level that is a problem in our nation, that is very old, but is much more serious today than I think it has ever been, certainly in the history of the United States and maybe in the history of the world. More than half a century ago, a sociologist, a Jewish sociologist named Daniel Bell, wrote a book called The Cultural Contradictions of Capitalism. And I'm not going to tell you the whole book, but the basic idea that he had was that the same things that makes capitalism successful work to undermine capitalism. So, for example, you have all these towns all over America that were once successful manufacturers of this, that, or the other, but the businesses found they could be more successful by exporting their business to another country, and now the town is basically a ghost town. That is, in becoming capitalist, they also ended up undermining the society that supported capitalism. One day we'll have self-driving cars. Imagine what that will do for every trucker, Uber driver, taxi driver, bus driver in America, all of a sudden. And he went on and on, not obviously with self-driving cars, he was writing a long time ago, talking about the ways in which capitalism undermines capitalism. When I was growing up, my father had a congregation that was a wealthy congregation. But the people who were wealthy and the people who were not wealthy lived on the same block, drove basically the same cars, were part of the same community. But the more capitalism succeeded, the more it pulls people apart by different social classes. And so, Bell said, capitalism has to be aware of capitalism's own contradictions so that capitalism can continue to do what it is that it does so well. And if you think about it, the countries that have been really successful, dynamic capitalist countries like South Korea, Taiwan, Israel, are countries that have a lot of social cohesion, where people know each other and live in communities together. And he said what's happening in America is that's flying apart, and that undermines capitalism itself. Now you're wondering, why is the rabbi talking about this? Has he all of a sudden become Marxist in his old age? No, I have not. I'm talking about it because another book that came out not so long ago and made a huge stir, called Bowling Alone, points to the real problem. Bowling Alone was a book about how there used to be bowling leagues, and everybody used to belong to a bowling league, and now people bowl alone. In other words, the voluntaristic associations that brought people together, didn't matter what class they were, where they lived, but they all came together. That's what sustains and supports capitalism, even though we don't usually think of it that way. Nobody thinks by coming to shul I'm being a good capitalist. But what I'm telling you is to go back to the Torah. What's the first thing you do? You give to the society as soon as you enter the land. You show that you are part of the entire community. And I actually think that what the last 2 years the pandemic have done also undermines the capitalist project by pulling us apart. And that part of what America needs to do now is to return to those places, synagogues, churches, community centers, volunteer places, organizations where we can reconstitute ourselves as a community. Because just making a lot of money, in the end, undermines the prosperity of the entire society, because if you don't have social cohesion, everything falls apart. The fact that this book was written some 70 years ago, pointing out these contradictions, shows that they're deep, that they always exist. But the way that America managed to overcome those contradictions was that it had neighborhoods and associations and synagogues and churches and people who stuck together and didn't allow their identity as someone who makes money to be the primary identity that they had. Some of them made a lot of money, but they still went to synagogue. They still knew people around them. They were still part of associations. They would still give food at soup kitchens. In other words, they still felt part of a community. We see this in what's happening to the family. We see this what's happening in our synagogues. And we see it what's happening all across America, where people don't even speak to one another because they feel so separate. So I think once again, the Torah gives us the answer, which is this voluntaristic spirit that says it's not only about me. Because weirdly, a society that is only about you will end up being a society that will not be about you. The only way it can be in part about me is if it's also about you. And the only way we can keep this project going if it's not an individual project, but an American project. And we recognize that the community is essential for the individual to thrive, just as individual autonomy is essential for innovation and dynamism and ultimately the community to thrive. But they are symbiotic. They go together. Without a strong community, you don't get dynamic individuals. And without dynamic individuals, you don't have much of a community. So what is the bottom line lesson? If you haven't renewed your membership for the high holidays, you are destroying capitalism. That's the message. I grant you, it took me a little while to get there. But join us. That's who we are. That's what we do. That is how we save America. Shabbat shalom.